budget review, please.
Good morning, everyone. On your handout this morning, you should find a packet at your seat. It's about 5 sections in it. The first 3 are the ones that we've been handing out forever. They show year-to-date budget results. It's really the same information carved up in different ways. The 4th one is a revenue change projection, primarily for fiscal year 2014. And the last one is the foundation report. I'll talk about 4 and 5 in a few minutes. I'm going to start with a few comments on in general. As far as where we are this year, we're about a third of the way through the year. We measure that by paychecks, so we're actually 32-point-some% through the year based on expense runs. We're running right at budget. Expenses are running right at, near, or at revenues, so there are no real concerns positively or negatively, or surprises or unknowns on that at this point. I'd say probably the thing that's it's good not to be over budget. It's good to run near your budget, but historically we generally run a little bit under that and had carryover that would build up that we would carry over into the next year. That's not happening this year, so we're not really building up any carryover. I mean, that's important in a minute. We did meet our state requirement to submit the initial budget, status quo budget, on September 30th. And I would like to, the only thing I would say on that is because of the way funding originates both at the state and the federal level, about 80 to 85% of our money is federal and 10 to 20% of it is state, depending on how you want to carve up things like elevator funds or inspection funds, that sort of thing. We end up going through numerous what we call budget versions. I think last year when we started, we usually start in August, September, October, and we put together our preliminary budgets. By the time that all of the information is available on revenues for that year, I think we ended up doing 13 versions. Now they don't change significantly, but as federal funding changes and or state funding change through that budgeting process, that ends up affecting our overall budget. Right now we're on version 3, so we have a ways to go. The legislature hasn't come back and started yet, but we did submit a status quo budget. That's the starting point, really. Status quo for state. You have to interpret that in the sense that status quo means in aggregate the same bottom line total. So that means if you have salary increases or expense increases, you have to fold that into that status quo to get to that same aggregate bottom line level. Federal is a little different animal. I mean, the state, I think, is right now a little bit more predictable on future revenues. The federal is what we're going through right now with major cuts in future funding. So we're working on that. A couple of things I want to point out on that as we go through it later on. One of the things that is happening is that our expense, while our costs in general are coming down, our projected federal revenue is declining more rapidly than what our expense reductions are running at, which means that even though we're doing a better job of driving down our costs, we're still having revenue issues because that federal funding is dropping. That's impacted us in a couple different ways. Like I said, we're not building up any carryover from revenue from one year to the next. What we call our emergency funds are shrinking. Our P&I, we're projecting our penalty and interest fund to be down to about less than $900,000 at the end of fiscal year 14 or fiscal year 2014. To give you an example, at the end of fiscal year 2013, it was 1.9 million. So it's about $1 million drop in that penalty and interest. We're projecting at the end of fiscal year 2014 the balance on the interest that we earn off the UI reserve fund will be gone. There will be no balance left. So that means, with all things considered, based on emergency funds, funding from the state, funding from the federal government, and our expense run, that we're still having an expense run higher than what our projected future revenues are. You'll see that we're still projecting funding shortfalls, which is the same as what I reported in September. I don't think that the totals have materially changed from the report that I gave you in September, and I'll get to the page where some of that shows up here in a second. But of course, you know, there are lots of variables that happen. And I've talked about this before. We get funding from numerous different funds. We have certainly state funds, but when you talk about federal funds, there are 50 to 60 different funds, revenue streams that we get. Some are very targeted that you can't use for any other purpose. Some have no carryover provisions. Some have 1 year carryover, some 2, some 3. Some have more leeway to be able to move that money around to needed locations is based on the guidelines. So that means that there are a lot of unknowns. Certainly there are unknowns. Unexpected costs. One of the things that we struggle with right now also is we have interagency expenditures. We pay DIA, we pay the state auditor, we pay the Attorney General offices for services. The largest one is the Department of Administrative Services. That's a significant one for us. That code has been going up in recent years in total dollars and as a percentage of our budget. And we work very hard on trying to manage those interdepartmental agency expenditures too. So in general, I think we look fairly good for this year. We're fairly close on our budget. But we're not building up revenues, and next year is really the year that I think I'm more worried about. Any questions on opening comments? If you look at, go ahead.
When you say next year, you're talking
Yes, the state op. And again, we have the overlapping period between the state and federal years, so it does get a little confusing when you're talking about years. If you look at the next to the last section in this book, and I'm sorry, they were put together in different sources, so they're not. It says, the cover page says, I will workforce development recap of revenue change. And you'll see, it's a page that looks like this. This gives you a recap of the changes in revenue, recap of revenue changes from FY13 to FY14. And you can see that our total revenue is dropping, and that we're projecting deficits for state funds of about 1.4 million, federal funds, and you look at the penalty and interest. So the net is about 4 million, which I think is almost exactly the same number that I reported in September. It might be a little bit smaller than I think it was maybe 4.1 or 4.2 in September, so it shrunk, that definitely shrank a little bit. The point I would make on this page is the line below that if we would go off the fiscal cliff and sequestration would kick in, that would more than double our projected federal shortfall. And it would be, it's already a challenge to try to manage the revenues and expenses based on a shrinking revenue environment. But sequestration would be obviously a huge challenge to try to manage our way through that. So now it's an 8.2% across the board cut. However, how they would distribute that revenue out, we're assuming it'd be a straight across the board for all programs. There's no real guarantee that percentage might vary a little bit by fund or by activity, but we don't know that. So based on that cherry picture, Yeah, I don't know if anybody has any questions about what we're presenting. I mean, it's a continuation of the last few years of revenue shrink, and then, in our world, expenses don't generally go down every year. They go up, and you have to find a way to manage your way.
So we had kind of the discussion before. The good news for the state of Iowa is that we continue to improve on our unemployment rate. And that's good news, but that's also then the number that goes into the formulas when the federal government calculates how much unemployment money they will distribute to the states. So obviously, states that have a 9% unemployment rate will get more of the federal funds than a state like Iowa that has 5.1% unemployment. So the thing that we're working on the most, obviously, is getting people jobs, and so that's kind of a two-headed dragon for us. And this is starting to continue to show that. And the other thing it shows is, if you recall, a couple of years ago, when we headed into this environment of such overwhelmingly low interest rates, that also significantly impacted our funds in the field offices, because prior to that, we had been earning $6 to $7 to $8 million a year on the unemployment trust fund, which generated funds specifically for use in our field offices. And now, instead of that $6 or $7 or $8 million, we earn about $500,000. And it varies, maybe 100,000 up or down, but that's directly related to the drastic change in our whole country of interest rates. And I don't think anybody is earning at a 6 or 7 or 10% interest rate anymore. Obviously, when state treasury invests the funds of the state, which is where our funds are, it's in the most conservative kind of investment pool, so we wouldn't be on the high side anyway. But nonetheless, it's a revenue resource that in the past we utilized quite a bit, that is just not in existence anymore because our rates are down at 1% or hovering around there. So
the state funds projected reduction 1.4. How do you project that?
You have to, it's the deficit I'm projecting. I'm not projecting the decrease in revenue. I'm saying that the gap between the revenue and our expenses is a deficit.
yeah.
That's if the line item were to remain the same.
Yes.
That's how much
That's
further
all
behind we're getting.
Yeah, what I should say too, that's a very good point, is the way we project revenues is based on really kind of three things. One is, if we know the number, we use the number. Sometimes based on federal funds, we know the numbers, sometimes we don't. If we don't know the number, we use status quo. And unless there's some piece of information we would know that would say that status quo isn't going to be what it is. So it's kind of nobody thinks accounting is an art, but it's a bit of an art, because you're trying to project into the future on things that you know and you don't know. And then you look at your expense run and you say, I project a deficit based on what I think my revenues are and what my expenses are.
So we continue to try to optimize. For instance, we just renegotiated a lease here in the Regional 11 in the 432 Strand building. It used to be on all 3 floors of that building, and now we're no longer on 3 floors. We were able to negotiate that lease with the landlord. We're now on two of the floors with our partners, and not all 3 floors. So that was, we are starting to now see the benefits of that. So as the size required for our offices change, we do all those same kinds of things that all you folks do, which is we try to make sure that you're paying a fair price and you're not overpaying for space and you don't have too much space. And we bring up administrative services because we have a large bill in all of the things we do. You can imagine the legacy systems and unemployment tax and all those kinds of things. We obviously pay for that. And so we're starting now to very, very carefully review our interagency charges. I don't think really agencies have done much of that in the past, but we're starting to review that very closely. And my goal is to, as we have done before, work through this and manage our way through this. As somebody might retire, we may not necessarily feel behind that kind of a job. Whatever it is, if it means that somebody has decided to retire for whatever their reasons are, and we can optimize and change work around. I mean, those are things that we are very careful about. And we are just, which impacts this budget, you should also know we are just on the very final pieces of finishing off the settlement that we have with Promise Jobs and AFSCME, and how the recall of employees and putting them, assigning them to the appropriate jobs and Promise Jobs, and working with our partners on that. So we're not quite finished with that. I think just yesterday I signed one of the last. I think John told me we had about 5, perhaps maybe 5 more positions, and so that's coming along as well. But all of those things, as you might guess, in managing through these kinds of issues, my goal is not to have any kind of big announcement or big change that we have to do, because the goal here is to try to manage our way through it. As we have opportunities, we'll try to maximize that, like rent or like outside charges and those kinds of things. And so we look at that every day in an attempt to help that red number get closer to 0, and that's what we do on
What do we have, 10 days? Is that what Congress has?
Yeah.
For their timetable,
Right.
and then not to throw out a political hot ball, but what a huge mistake turning our backs on that 15 million was. I mean, this is exactly what we're talking about when we as a state, I'm sorry, the governor's office, maybe a little bit here too, but we turned our back on that 15 million that not only were we eligible for, but was Iowa's money. It was Iowa taxpayer dollars. And now when we're looking at a $15 million that we turned our back on, and then we're looking at projected deficits of $8 million, I think that comes into play. I know it's hindsight. My New Year's resolution will be quit looking back. But it's hard when you see this much red ink facing us right now. And it could be argued, as someone called me last night and said, well, it just looks like the feds are doing what we did at the state level. And that could be argued too when we talk about cuts. So hopefully we'll be able to move forward with adequate funding. You know, I don't want to speak for Ron, but I think we'll do what we can at the state level to make us able to perform and reach the clients that we're meaning to reach. We need to look at the DAS charges. We really do as some way to save money for the workforce development. But the next 10 days are crucial, and Steve might know more. I'm sure you know more than I do, but about what's going on at the federal level, because on the phone this morning coming in, there's a big late push for combining programs. And we've heard this a number of times, but it sounds as if there's something fairly concrete in writing that they're batting around, but I have no idea what it looks like.
It seems like every time, I know we've gone down to combining programs on 4 or 5 or 6 different times in the last 12 months, and every combination is a little different. Obviously, depending on which constituencies or which states are pushing for the combinations. I just had a call yesterday with Jay Knowles, the Assistant Secretary of Labor, and we were talking about the unfortunate hostess event that most of our states have to deal with. And they at her level, at any rate, we're still much in the dark about if they are not necessarily, they don't have a capsule of ideas that they're going to be pushing. I think it's really going to be, based on what I know, I just don't think we're going to know until the day it's done, that whatever it is done. And that might be something as simple as moving it ahead another 6 months, I don't know. But we have just had no indication of a direction on the federal side. So our team takes our trends and tries to forecast that into our federal numbers. And that's, and some would say this is the most optimistic piece of paper you're ever going to see about what might happen on the federal side. I don't know, I just don't know. So we take the history and the data that we have thus far, and we take, we get a quarterly settlement on some of those federal funds, and that number has been going all over the map, actually. If our 4 quarters were to be on what our last quarterly settlement with the feds were, we would all have great frowns on our face because it was very small. But these things tend to correct themselves quarter after quarter. So we use, we don't just use the last quarter. We use several months in the past as our trend and kind of what we know and see about these funds, and that this is the latest information that we have, which is not much, actually. So
I'm hearing this greater likelihood, don't be surprised if the can's not kicked down the
Yeah,
road,
me
that
too.
as we get closer to the end of the month,
Yeah,
it's
it's
gonna
only-
push out 60 or 90 more days or whatever.
at max maybe 10 more working days that Washington will stay working, absent the holidays, and it's been in a very closed environment. So the negotiators are, I think, at this point, keeping it very closed environment. So
If all these revenue numbers and everything stays, this becomes true.
Yeah.
And we're showing an $8 million deficit. Are we obligated to show a balanced budget that we made $8 million of cuts, or just what happens with this deficit?
well, we'll be obligated. This is for fiscal year 14, which will be for the federal budget will begin next October. But we'll be obligated. I mean, we won't have the money, so we'll be obligated to get our operations into that operating environment, because we will not have the money. Now, in the past, we've used some of our reserve funds to help us over these points in time, which is what our P&I has been used for in the past and those sorts of things. But in the past, we haven't had this kind of problem. We've been getting the other situation, which is we have had the benefit of a lot of funds which have been inputted into helping the unemployment issue and helping economic development and helping trying to kickstart us through a recession. So we used that money and got used to operating under that environment, which now all that money is gone. And any cushion that people might have thought we had, we don't have anymore. Not only that, but any earning potential that we had, we don't have anymore because of where the interest rate environment is. So all of those resources don't exist. And it's not because anybody was good or bad at anything, it's just the nature of the environment now is so drastically different. And so we'll have to figure out ways to, we'll have some time, although 6 months isn't a whole lot of time to try to get inside of a sizable number like that. But, the time will come when if you don't have the money, you can't, so you have to
See,
address.
this is fairly typical. There's a lot of organizations, agencies that have been living off of this, what we call the one-time funding that is now going away. We're dealing with the same thing with the Iowa College Student Aid Commission. Of being used to using some funds that aren't going to be there anymore because of direct lending. So now change from having to be paid there to something.
Yes, but we're trying to make changes gradually not some kind of a drastic effect like it was a couple of years ago. And so that people have predictability and stability in their employment, but we can still meet as much of the needs as we can fund out in our communities and the people that we serve and businesses that we serve. So those are all the things that you balance inside of what the changes are. So obviously, the goal is to have a good plan so that as we get closer and closer, the red numbers get smaller and smaller and get much closer to zero.
So if you submit the status quo budget to the legislature this year, we're still going to be where we are. There's no work from the legislature to try to help with that.
Well, yes,
I-
there is. We've been asked by the governor to submit a status quo budget, and we don't. And that's what gives us the $1.5 million red number.
Right.
Now, many things can be done. For instance, the legislature can decide to fund separately the changes in salary. Currently, we just have to figure out how to make that up in our operation. But the legislature could say, and we're gonna make sure that salary changes are specifically funded outside of the status quo budget because they're not funded in the status quo budget. So that's something that they could do and have done in past years. I don't know how that will turn out, but that is something that can be done. Last year we had the legislature asked us, for instance, funded us specifically to add another position for the offender reentry program. So they specifically added money into that singular line item that we had to go from 3 to 4 because of the great results that we have, and in the long run saves the entire state money because recidivism rate goes down, and then you don't have to fund people in prison, and you help get them off to a better start when they get out of prison, and so that's something that the legislature could do is say, for this specific reason, we want to, in addition to the status quo budget, fund something separate. And the legislature can do that too. And that's something that they did last year, and that we have now got that person in place and just got that off and running. So those are the kinds of things that the legislature can do. So yeah, there are a lot of things. If they come together with same mindset, that can be done.
We also, as Teresa said earlier, we do try to turn over every rock about how we're spending. She talked about 430 East Grand. That was a large amount of money that we're going to save on rent expense. We have the same thing going on at Cedar Rapids. We have the same thing in Iowa City where we moved into a smaller footprint and save a significant amount of money. So we're going through those things. We look carefully at every expense and try to find a way to make sure that the money we do spend is well spent, done efficiently, and that we're getting the value that we should for that.
Another example is I just met for a while yesterday on people getting notifications for a variety of things, whether it's for an appeal or whether it's for records or whether it's for coming information from our office. And we do everything by mail. You can imagine what that costs. By mail, it's by mail. And so then as we talk about it, we say, well, how dependable is the Postal Service these days? I mean, let's get serious about how people receive information. So we talk through what some alternatives are that perhaps we could suggest rule changes to help the electronic delivery of some of these things. And of course, then that drastically impacts your budget when you don't have to use the Postal Service or certified mail. And so we're looking at those kinds of alternatives as well.
I can understand understand the governor's motivation of saying status quo, because in the 2 short years I've been in the Iowa legislature, I've noticed in a lot of cases, state agencies are not motivated to save money until they have to. And so by saying status quo, this forces agencies to look at their operations and say, how can I balance with the same amount of revenue to make sure that we get those savings, instead of just saying, well, give us more money. And I found that with the Department of Transportation. The governor said, I need $50 million before we'll consider a road tax increase. Well, all of a sudden, here's $50 million. Well, how come you haven't done that in the past? Well, nobody really asked us to. So it's those type of philosophies, so I understand.
Of course, no one mentioned gas tax before.
Right.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that's what's going to end up happening. We'll look for efficiencies, and then, hopefully we'll adequately fund it to our communities that are there.
Is there action that the state legislature can do based on these numbers that impact the 80% of federal funds, or is that just completely, there's nothing they can do that even helps ease that
No,
number at
really
all?
not. The
They're
biggest,
just totally separate.
biggest impact of that really is how we do economically sustain. As I said before, because all these funds are really formulaically driven. Really not.
We still have the age-old thing we've all wrestled with, is how that unemployment figure is reached, because people fall off the rolls. It's good that it's going lower, I think, and hope. And of course, my pet peeve over the years is we don't measure underemployment.
Correct.
And it's really too bad in the state of Iowa, because we have thousands of people who are working 2 and 3 part-time jobs that would fall under that unemployment category. They're working, because Iowans always want to work, so they're working, and we don't get any credit for it, and quite frankly, they don't get any credit for it. They're working hard, and we don't have the tools to take them a step further in that full-time position or further training. I mean, we have some tools, but it isn't comprehensive.
But, and that's all true, but the equalizing piece is that all states are measured that same way. So BLS measures for all the inequities in that, everybody has their share of inequities that are all the same, and so that's, I guess the inequities even out is the same throughout the state. But we don't measure that, and we don't measure those who have dropped off completely, and who are on perhaps a different kind of welfare subsistence that don't get into our accounts for unemployment numbers, but yet we try to use as many opportunities as we can to help those folks as well.
If there aren't any other questions or comments, there's one more section I need to go through, and that's the foundation financial report. Starting last year, I believe we decided that we would give annual update on the financial documents for the foundation. So the very last section, you'll see the first page is the balance sheet, which don't really have too many comments on that. I think the next page is a little better because it breaks it down a little bit more. Historically, there had been 3 accounts. The S1 monument, S4 conferences, and S5 clearing accounts. And you can see in those accounts, the balances are minimal. There's really very little activity. We get some small interest amounts. We do take money out of that for state fair. I guess on those, it's pretty straightforward. But we do have a new account. We did have a new account, S4.1, which is Skilled Iowa. That account that was set up to handle the money that was contributed for Skilled Iowa. It flows into that account and then it flows out for the Skilled Iowa. So this is marketing primarily is the expenditure on that. So
Where did the money come from, the contribution?
Private donations. Bill Knapp and myself and others asking companies or people to the marketing and the furthering of the Skill Iowa program, they can make a private contribution because this is a private, 501c3.
Any other questions?
Paul, I have a couple. First off, I'd like to thank you and Kelly, because I know you guys watch this very accurately and every day, and the reports are very nice, and you answer our questions. But if I can go back to the Iowa Workforce Development Budget Expenditures section,
Yes.
page 5,
Yep.
it's unobligated funds. Is it, it's my understanding that these are one-time funds that, where it says unobligated, that we pay out and then we,
I'm sorry, I'm trying to get sure.
looks like this.
Is it the budget expenditures?
It's a short page, page 5.
You should really remember this.
Monthly expenditure report by division and program, it says on the top. Looks like that.
This
That
one? Okay.
So these are funds that are paid out and then we don't have to pay them again? Is that correct? Or there's no substantial money coming in for them?
I'm gonna let Kelly go through the funds because he's more of an expert, but
Well, that's a general question.
I'm not sure. Can you repeat? I was still trying to get the page.
Okay, these are monies that we are spent,
No,
monies that go out and then,
Yeah, yes, that is, budget is a little bit different there. That's really unobligated funds, so
yeah,
that's a
I'm
fund.
trying to find out what the word unobligated means, I guess.
Well, some of that money, for example, the money that's listed under REDAC, that's for the modernization programs. That's not necessarily, we're not necessarily going to spend that money this year. We're probably going to spend that money next year, but that entire pot of money, on one hand, it's obligated for that particular project, but it's not obligated in the current state fiscal year.
Oh,
It's probably
okay.
going to be spent in future state fiscal years. The biggest ones you've got there.
Well, that's what I'm trying to figure out, what the
Yeah.
word unobligated means.
And just for the current year, we don't intend to spend the money in the current year.
All right.
The money will probably be spent in the future year.
Then the Wagner-Pizer unobligated includes, and I'm not exactly sure what that is, because ASME has a C in it. We're the American,
That'd be my
we're the
misspelling.
American Federation of State County Municipal Employees, so you just left out a
That-
large constituency of county employees, there are about 10,000 members.
I'm not sure, I think actually that statement should be taken out, it shouldn't say ask me reimbursements.
Well, that's why I'm curious, is that back to the settlement that we had over?
No, no. It's got-
Where'd the 517,000, was that?
That is just, the Wagner-Pizer grant's about a $6.5 million grant, and for the current year, all of that is obligated for state employees except for 517,000.
Okay,
Now, what makes that number look bad is a year ago, that number was 1.5 million.
that's what.
Now it's only $500,000, so that means their carryover is shrinking
All right.
from
Those
year
are-
to
so
year.
really-
The
really a good
reimbursement is
question.
for, this is where I'm going, the reimbursement is for what?
Actually, that's my mistake, take that statement completely out, ask me reimbursement. That actually applied to a UI grant that we received, and when it said ask me reimbursements, it's when when employees go to attend AFSCME meetings and we get reimbursement for the cost of them attending the AFSCME meetings.
Okay.
That money just rolls into the same pot of money as wherever that person was working. So if that person was working on the Wagner-Pizer program, they take time off to attend those meetings, we get reimbursed for it. That reimbursement goes back into the same original
Okay,
funding
now I
source.
got it.
Okay?
All right, so when these Wagner-Pizer employees, as per our collective bargaining agreement, and then you guys continue to pay them.
We continue to pay them, we seek
And then you send us a
reimbursement.
bill,
Right.
and we reimburse you.
We have to make sure it goes back to that exact same pot of money.
Okay, so it could go to UI, or it could
Yeah,
go to
yeah, and that's-
whatever division
Right.
it comes out. Now I understand.
Yeah.
All right, that's what I'm looking for.
But I think you touched on some good questions, because what you really, if you look at what you have, this this is what I'm talking about when there are a number of different funds that we get, and those funds have different guidelines that are conditional.
But this really isn't, that part isn't really a
Yeah.
fund, that's
But
really
it's
what
also-
Kelly just said, it's a reimbursement.
Correct, it's a round,
So,
round.
it's
But
just a,
but also puts into that play that there are different rules for different funds. Some we can use, some we can't, some we can carry over, some we can't.
I mean, that's
And the
actually,
second part, when Kelly talks about Whiting Kaiser, and we talked earlier about that we're not building up, because we're close to our budget, we're not building up carryover. That's kind of what this is talking about, is that we're not.
okay. Well, it makes sense now, the reimbursement part.
right, and I actually could have used that same term on almost every category there, because it could be the Trade Act program where the person was working, or the unemployment grant where they were working, so.
Yeah, and then the department gets reimbursed regardless. They could get reimbursed by the Ticket to Work group. or-
Yeah, wherever they have, whatever program they have to be
I'm
working on.
curious, that 517,000?
Out of that total, you're probably talking about 2,000 or 3,000 of that dollars really relates back to AFSCME.
Yeah.
The rest of that is the Wagner
The
Pfizer
rest of
grant.
it is the Wagner project.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah,
So why don't, you'll fix that though, so we'll call it correctly on what our these reports are.
you know I have to walk around so I
I
can
know,
hear.
I know. You'll change the title on that, so it's more appropriate.
Actually, I'll just take that wording completely out, because like I said, it applies to every program in the agency.
Okay.
If someone's state funded and they attend ASME union meetings, then the money goes back to the state funded program, or the UI program, or the Trade Act program,
Or the
whichever
Wagner,
one.
whichever pays.
Whichever
them.
one was paying for their salary.
But,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I don't want anybody on the board to think that the entire.
There's definitely not 500 some thousand coming
There's
back
really
from
not
the union.
13 million
I don't
coming
think
back
so.
from the, we would love to have 13 million. I think President Holman would probably get a new building instead of new carpet.
Any other questions, comments?
Just thank you, Paul and Kelly, for always making it the point where lay people like me can understand it.
Okay, now we are into legislative proposals. Deputy Director.
Good morning, everyone. There is one bill that will be required of us this year, federal conformity legislation pertaining to fraud overpayments. I think I'm going to turn it over to Joe Burbid to give us a little bit of an explanation of what that will look like.
Okay, yes, as Ed said, we have one bill this year, it's a conformity bill, so that means that it's federal law changes from the Middle Class Tax Act, and it needs to be passed with this legislative session. Failure to do so means that Iowa employers would pay $500 million more in UI federal unemployment taxes. And failure to pass it would mean that the federal government Department of Labor would cancel our administrative budget that pays for the administration of the unemployment insurance program. So we wouldn't have any money to run the unemployment program. So there are severe sanctions for failure to pass. Having said that, the bill is very simple. It has two components. The one is a 15% penalty for fraudulent overpayments. We would add on a 15% penalty. That 15% goes into the unemployment trust fund to pay benefits as required by federal law. And also with federal law, we can't offset that 15% penalty from future unemployment benefits the way we would an ordinary overpayment. So we would use other collection means to collect the 15%. The second part of it is an employer initiative in terms of employers who fail to participate, which is usually by phone or sending information in at the first level of an unemployment benefit fact-finding. And then that results in the person being found eligible for benefits, it's appealed, the employer shows up and says, no, actually, there were circumstances here, which results in a disqualification and an overpayment. Under this law and under the federal requirement that we don't relieve those charges for that employer. Their tax rate is based on those charges because they essentially caused the unemployment overpayment, is the theory, by not participating at the first level. So when we estimate with those, we're talking about 500 or less cases a year. Currently, we relieve the overpayment. We don't set up the overpayment under current law, but we do non-charge the employer. So that would be the change. It's federal legislation. It is necessary to be passed by the state by October 13th of next year, or there would be sanctions.
Let's start second year. Can you review what we did last year?
Right, this is our second year. The bill is identical as last year's. Representative
I have a
Jorgensen.
short memory, but this looks awful familiar.
Yeah, it would look familiar to you especially, but yes, because we had
Pass
it
it.
through.
But it-
No, so we have to do it again.
Right, we did pass the House last year. We're hopeful, we think this year that unusual with these issues, that they, with federal conformity issues and it being on the non-controversial side, that some balance to it, that it will get through both houses this year.
And last year, it didn't have resistance in the Senate. It just wasn't taken up because other things, timing issues.
I have but can yield to a question? What was the Chamber Alliance's position on this bill, do you remember?
I don't,
I don't think they
I don't
have.
think they took it.
Okay, because I'm trying, but there was
Talking
a
to
significant,
John Gilliland, and he was okay with it, and we're cleaning it up.
ADI?
ABI took a neutral position, but I couldn't remember what John from the Chamber Alliance, but there was someone who was adamantly against it, and I can't remember who was kind of,
I don't remember at the time.
and it might not be, I'm just trying to remember.
My knowledge, it never surfaced in our.
In your discussions or anything.
Well, there was some discussion about the business community, how you do a pattern of failing to participate in hearings. The approach of our bill is that we look at that employer, and if they fail to participate, then we said we would charge them for that, because, as I said, to keep track now, and out of our 16,000 hearings, we have less than 500 a year that get appealed, but we have to keep track of like 160,000 fact findings and record whether the employer participated. And that's a computer system and a whole bunch of money to do that for less than 500 overpayments. So there's two ways you can do that, and there was some discussion about that, and we discussed that too last year.
We don't plan to have any other legislative bills from workforce development at this time. I believe, though, you might just visit a little bit, Joe, about the new conformity piece that we believe will be getting from the federal government, but we don't have any words yet until maybe January or so. What topic is that on?
Right, that's on voluntary shared work.
Yeah.
And Representative Jacoby, I think you're probably familiar with the program. There's a lot of employers in Coralville that use it. Middle Class Tax Act pays for the benefits. They're going to reimburse us for all the benefits back to February of 2012. Okay, but in order to get, there's administrative funding and public relations funding available. I think for Iowa, I'll have to get the exact numbers, but 100,000, maybe up to 300,000 to 2/3 of that is administrative. A new computer system would help. We do a lot of that. We automate it as much as we can, but a new system, you could automate it some more with the new technology. We wouldn't get that money until this session or next session. The legislature would need to pass some technical changes from the federal law. First, they said there were no changes. Our bill now says, or our law now says temporary unemployment, that it would cover. Federal law took that out, so it's just any situation where the employer has to lay some people off and wants to do shared work instead, which is, instead of laying off 40% of your workforce, you keep everybody working 60% of the time, and we pay them 40% of the unemployment benefit, so it's kind of a win-win for everybody. So there's some technical changes that they're running that through the Department of Labor through their review process. Maybe late this year, they said, or early next year, they would get the changes to us for Iowa. So then we really can't proceed until we get official word from them. But they are basically technical changes. I mean, there's nothing big. I mean, we know it matches the federal law, but there are going to be some small changes.
So that would be the only other item that,
Back on this, Joe, fraudulent seems to me to be,
Strong.
well, no, but how do you prove they were intending fraud? I mean, how do you prove this?
Right, that was one of the questions in the legislature too, what's fraud? It's defined in our administrative rules, and, we have pretty much a bright line test for it because we have to code every overpayment for the federal government as fraud or non-fraud. So we pretty much have a line in it. It's provided for in the administrative rules. Fraudulent is receiving it, a deliberate act or omission knowingly made to receive benefits to which they're not entitled. So, there has to be some intent with that, or at least an indifference to the point where it becomes deliberate.
Good luck.
why we have lawyers, actually.
Well, in courts and appeal
Prove or
boards.
disprove it, I don't know.
Any other questions for legislation?
I do have one question.
Yes.
Joe, it says here, you made a comment earlier that you can't pay the penalty out of the state funds. This 15% penalty, is that assessed to the individual or the company?
Yeah, the 15% penalty is for a fraud overpayment, and it would be an assessment for that individual that got the fraudulent overpayment. So if they had, $500 they had gotten, generally with us, the usual one is they don't report income. So they've been working for 4 weeks. We ask them every week on the phone, did you work this week? They say no. We say, did you have any wages? They say no. Well, they got this money, so we have a $2,000 overpayment. Then we would attach on top of that to that individual. We would say, you owe $2,000, $2,300, I think, 15% more on top of that. And then the thing with that is under the federal law, normally our major way to collect that is future benefits they may be eligible for. We would take that off, and we could do that with the fraudulent overpayment, but you can't do it with the 15%. The 15% you gotta usually do vendor offsets, income tax offsets. We're trying to get with the federal government for income tax offsets, garnishments, liens, confiscating money and property.
That's time consuming.
It is time consuming.
Costly.
It is costly. It is, it can pay for itself. You have someone working full-time doing it. It is labor intensive and, there's diminishing returns, but it does pay for itself. You can collect enough to justify those positions. I know, because I've been tracked for a couple of years.
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
I thought I justified it. Maybe I really didn't.
It is ever so little bit.
Joe, thank you for saying that, because I'm sitting down here at the end going, is it really worth all this? You know, 15%? Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot, but
Well, I don't know about the 15%.
where you say it actually pays for itself in the end.
Well, you do with all of them when you have, I mean, you don't just do the 15%, you know, you look at it, if the person's not collecting benefits now, then you can file a lien, you know, the tax refunds or the state vendor payments, that includes lottery, those things, you know, there's not much work involved to doing that, that's all computerized, and then we would get that money. And when you go out and try and find somebody where they're working, that gets very labor intensive. You know, we have the wage records, so we know where they worked 3 months ago. But then, not to get too technical, but this isn't taxes, so we only get so much a year. We can only take like about $800. You know, the wage limitations apply. So, but you do that on a mass enough scale, you know, and you can collect some money.
There's all the collection, not just the 15%.
Right.
That's
Yeah,
It's the 15% part that I think is maybe diminishing return on it.
Right, you lump that in with everything. I mean, you've got whole payments where people aren't collecting benefits now, and you collect those, you do that now. So, no, maybe this by itself, you know, would be an issue, I don't know, but with everything else, it justifies it well. And there's a deterrent value too. You know, you have to do something where people know that you're not going to.
Oh, that I don't argue. Not that I argue very much anyway, but thank you.